You got it.
Great, thanks, Grant. Great to have you and your perspective in the group.
Yeah, thanks for leading this group, Gary and Shelley.
Sure. Who else do we have? Lou, was Lou here yesterday? I don't think so.
Hi, I came in late and I'm kind of lurking. I do stormwater and solid waste reduction for the city of American Canyon in California. It's a really small city, but I'm really excited about what I'm seeing and hearing. This has come a long way, and I'm really pretty impressed with all the work you guys have done, and I really appreciate you doing this workshop.
Great, thank you, Luke. Great to have you with us. I think that's it for the new faces. I gave a little bit of a review in the large group there, but just to recap for the folks that are new here, I'll just give a super brief summary of what we did yesterday, and then I'd just like to check in with everybody. Just Joan, you sort of got us started there. You know, often as things keep percolating over the course of a day, and new thoughts come up. So I just wanted to kind of check in and see if there's other thoughts, just like that one, that may be relevant to our progress going forward. Yesterday, we mostly focused on identifying those management questions and mapping the barriers to addressing those questions onto that space of those management questions, and we kind of tweaked them as we went, and dealt with some semantic issues for what we thought were barriers, what we thought were the actual questions, and got to where I think was a pretty tight framework that we can start moving forward with. And like I said, today we'll start putting all those pieces together and driving towards those data products. But I was just wondering, are there additional thoughts that come up with folks that we'd want to sort of keep in mind as we're going forward, that resulted with some percolation when your brain got a little time off during the day?
Hi, sorry to drop in late. I don't know if that last comment was to me, but I'm a fishery researcher, so I'm just moving between groups trying to figure out how the trash datathon works. So I'm sorry to arrive late.
No problem at all. Malati?
Yes, it is Malati.
Malati. Okay, great. Yeah, you're welcome to stick around as long as it sounds interesting.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other thoughts about where we got to yesterday and where we're headed today? Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Is everybody seeing my screen? Yes? Okay. Here we go, day 2. Like I said, yesterday we focused on objective number 1, primarily putting those questions in place and identifying the barriers. And today we're going to see how they can all connect up together and drive towards those data products. I think we have a little bit more time today than we did yesterday, so I think we're going to have no problem actually getting to a good place to share with the wider group. Yesterday, we spent a little bit of time kind of heads down. Everybody started working on their own questions on the boards, and that was really useful because we generated a lot of content. It wasn't quite as much fun as when we were all sort of discussing things together, and so that was my preference actually for yesterday, was when we were talking about the different elements that we were throwing up on the board. Just because it felt like it generated a little bit more understanding. But I'd be happy to hear from the rest of the group which of those formats people prefer, because we can do either. We can do some heads down time, or we can do more discussion time, whichever folks found most useful.
I think the mix was helpful to have like a lot down on the slides to be able to talk about.
Yeah.
I agree. It was nice to be able to think for a minute and then to collaborate.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to wordsmith your thoughts if you're talking or thinking about what you're going to say next. So we can do it. We can do a little bit of that heads down style today too. Okay. So today we'll just review the progress that we made, get ourselves up to speed with building those pieces that we did. We'll discuss what the additional pieces we have to put in place are. That'll probably happen just up to lunch, and then we're going to start putting it all together into a framework that is kind of that logical sequence of actions that needs to happen to get to the data products to address our research questions. Just kind of went through that already. So this was one of the main things that we ended up with yesterday, our 4 research questions. And again, these were the research questions that sort of floated to the top in terms of level of importance and capacity to address them for this group. These aren't necessarily the most important questions in trash. They just reflect the perspectives of the people that we have in the room, and that's perfectly okay, because part of what we're doing with this exercise is just to educate our intuitions of how to step through this process, and we'll have sort of a tangible example of what comes out the other end for these specific research questions. So we have our gaps mapped onto each of these questions. I think what happened when we were discussing this was we realized that, well, certainly some of these gaps are just relevant for all of these questions. And so we had to kind of narrow our criteria a little bit and start saying, okay, well, which question are these gaps most important to? For which of these questions are these gaps the most critical for lessening our capacity to address them? And so that helped us kind of push things into quadrants. But the one that stayed in the middle was data standardization and translation between data types and formats. That was just one of those things that, along with coordination between groups, no matter which of these questions we're trying to answer, it always seemed like that was something that stood at the center. That, I mean, it's great that the Trash Monitoring Group is putting a lot of effort towards trying to solve that problem, because this group has come to the same conclusion that a number of other discussions have, that it's really difficult to move forward and even understand where the gaps are without being able to do that, not even necessarily at a data translation level, but at least a metadata level. Like Shelley mentioned yesterday, just a map would be incredibly useful of all the different groups that are collecting trash data, the level of data they're collecting in terms of data types, frequency of measurement, extent of measurement, etc. Just that would be incredibly useful for being able to understand what our capacity is to address some of these questions. Any further thoughts on where we got to on this little map from yesterday? It's a pretty good breadth of questions. We're going all the way from materials that might create toxicity. That, there was a great presentation from Scott about, how we can use data to understand impacts in the environment, all the way up to these broader scale questions of where's the trash coming from? How much is coming from where and making its way into waterways in the ocean? So it's a good range of question types. Okay. We're all feeling good about where we've been. Let's find out where we are going. Where we just started on yesterday at the end was doing the same exercise of mapping into the question space, but not barriers, but the data types. And Kate had the great idea of specifying particular use cases, just because it's just too vague probably without doing that. So I thought that was a great idea. And so that's where we're going to start today, is trying to fill out these use cases in terms of purpose, scale. There's probably a number of other elements for use case that I'm not thinking of right now, and the data types that would be most amenable to addressing these research questions for these use cases. And just to review, this is the framework that we're starting with in terms of a broad categorization of data types, and there's probably, you know, other data types or dimensions along which we can break up different types of data collection, but we think this is a pretty useful one. Shelley, can you sort of give us the rundown on this one more time so that we remember what these are?
Yeah, so this is a diagram that comes from the trash monitoring playbook that will be coming out in the next month or two. And this was a project funded by the OPC, where we looked at 3 already existing methods and 1 novel method. That novel method was the UAS method, or the drone method. And the way we looked at it was these methods went from pretty simple to very complex. And so the visual method is basically splitting it out into different categories based on the assessor's perceived perception of how much trash was in a given area. Then when we used the drone, we basically looked at analyzing the imagery to say whether items were considered to be plastic or not plastic. And then tier 3 is looking at volume estimates. That's a method that's used primarily by the Bay Area Stormwater group. And basically, we've split those into different categories as far as what each item was made out of, whether it was plastic or metal or glass. And then finally, the most complex method and the most time-consuming method certainly is the tally method, where you've got all the different items, specific items, so we can identify plastic bags or cups or any other type of things you might find out in the environment. And the way we look at this is we can actually share the data going up the tiers. So what you collect if you went out and did the tally method could be applied to some of the other methods as well. You certainly could get to what we might categorize something as in the visual method. You can actually split things out if you've used the tally method by whether it was plastic or not plastic. And we can actually come up with equations to calculate volume, rough estimates of volume based on the items that we found in tier 4. So there's a lot of things that go on between these different tiers, and we're hopeful that we can put a system in place where we can use any type of data somebody might have collected in order to compare it to some other types of data. Yeah, that's it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Questions about this tiering system that Shelley and folks have developed for this? What's it called again? The handbook, the
Trash monitoring playbook.
Playbook. I'll just comment, the reason that this is relevant for where we're going right now, as we kind of tried to illustrate with a couple of examples yesterday, is that depending on the type of data that you decide to collect in your experimental design, well, it's going to be more or less amenable to addressing particular research question. In the case of the question of whether plastic bag bans have been effective at lessening trash accumulation or plastic bag litter in cities, unless you're down here in the tally of specific items, well, those data, once you're up here and you're just kind of measuring how big the piles of trash are, those data aren't very useful for addressing that question. Likewise, if your goal or your research question is to identify the degree to which trash accumulation is changing throughout an entire city, and where the most severe problems are, you're probably not going to get enough coverage. It's probably going to take too much resources to do this type of data collection, and so you're in better shape up here on those tiers to address those questions that require that wider coverage. Any other thoughts on data types before we launch into specifying them for our questions? Okay. So for this one, I thought maybe I'll just, because I think we're going to be talking through a lot of this, I can just function as scribe, and we can, I can have you folks talk instead of me talking, and I will write. Same quadrant space of our 4 questions. And I like your idea, Kate, of starting with these use cases for each question. So if we start up here, what are the relative source contributions of trash in waterways? What use case are we specifying? At what scale and for what purpose are we asking this question? It's not an easy thing to do. These are sort of abstract concepts.
Sorry, I have a question. I'm a little confused still what a use case is. So what Shelley just showed us was tiers, but is each of those tiers considered a use case, or?
Great question. When we get down here to specifying the data types, I think that's where those tiers of data are going to be a useful way to break out those different types. Kate, can you tell us what you had in mind in particular for these use case specifications?
Yeah, for sure. So I think about, like, we've got all these questions that stem from like management questions, but when I think about management, it's really a person somewhere making choices and decisions. And so I think if we can anchor, like, we don't need to have a specific person in mind, but sometimes it's helpful when thinking about use cases to give it like a who. Like on the question in the bottom left quadrant, maybe this is an easier one to think about. If the management question is, are our current trash reduction efforts having an appreciable effect? The use case might be a city decides to implement a new trash reduction effort, and the use case is that they want to see the before and after, like what was the delta of whether, like, I think we could specify, is it about trash leakage into waterways, right? Because reduction presumably, yeah, I guess it depends on what type of management effort, how exactly we measure that, but I would simplify the use case to be to like look at the before and after effects of a reduction effort. Because that tells us something about the data that we're going to need. Like, we want to see the levels before and the levels after, and we can get clearer on the use case to decide like what more specificity around that data and whether we care about, are we looking at plastic reduction specifically?
I have one for the one above that when you get a chance.
Yeah. Go, Joan.
Okay, so what we're looking at currently is the source of trash and how to involve the community in reducing illegal dumping, as well as you know, just random trash littering. We have a big problem of illegal dumping, not just on the streets and in vacant lots and out of way places, but also in our waterways. And while it is well known by the county and the cities involved, and they do clean it up when requested, we have a need for a more concerted effort, both in cleanup, especially before rain events, and in convincing the public not to dump and also not to litter. So I hope that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So it's more like illegal dumping prevention in response.
Yeah, this is making me think that this question's a lot about how to prioritize, like where we put management efforts, right? If we understand illegal dumping has like so much more effect than spilled dumpsters, then we can put our efforts over there. So maybe like part of the use case is around how to prioritize resources.
Great.
Other priority use cases for understanding for this question that we might consider?
I think a big one would be the need to know how much homeless encampments are contributing to the trash in the waterways.
That's great. We do have homeless encampments that are in the waterways, living in the culverts, as well as alongside the culverts. And those have been identified, but maybe that's another data point to understand where the encampments are.
Yeah, we were gonna when we were doing some of the riverine studies here in Southern California, I looked into trying to find a map of where homeless encampments were, and there just wasn't anything. When I was talking with folks, they basically said it was nearly impossible to do something like that because of how much they move around, and so I was never able to find anything specifically down here.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that this question, the use case the thing that all those things have in common and seems to be many of these different kind of sources have different management responses, and it helps to prioritize. I think that's what Kate said, is helps to prioritize which management responses get investment, you know. And Shelley, I think we have a map of all the homeless encampments in the San Diego riverbed, and we have to go out 3 times a week to keep it up to date.
Wow.
So it's like an incredibly dynamic thing. So we do weekly reports of how many encampments are on public property, public agencies, private property, etc. And it literally changes every single week.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Right. So can I ask a question? So Scott, when he did his presentation, he talked about the relative contribution of microplastics. I have a hard time imagining like homeless encampments are a huge source of microplastic contribution. So if you were to be looking at something like that, I'm still getting my mind around this use case, but would there be like, I don't know, municipal monitoring of company refuse or company dumping? Sorry, I don't know if that's the right way to ask it, but the right wording.
Well, I'll say one thing about homeless encampments is just because that's a huge part of what we do. And I would say that they're probably a pretty significant contributor to microplastics in eventually, just because of the amount of tarps and like other plastic materials that break down. I would, at the point that they're in those encampments, I would say they're probably still macro, but much of that stuff breaks down if it's not removed from the environment, and a lot of it breaks down quickly. But I think to answer your question about companies, if we're knowing the relative source of these contributions, I think that one thing that this question doesn't totally get at is the geospatial element of like, not just what is the relative source, but where are we observing that? And I don't know if we want to consider adding that to the question, because it might make sense, because that kind of gets to what you're saying, is that if we're also trying to arrive at where did it come from, like did it come from a specific business, is it escaping from a trash can from a specific business or being dumped by a specific business, maybe it says like we're saying what is the relative source. I was originally thinking that in terms of like overall contribution by source, but it might make sense to be, yeah, what and where.
Yeah, that where kind of factors in, especially if you're looking at educational campaigns or outreach for programs like, how to properly dispose of bulk items and stuff like that. So that where geospatial aspect is pretty important.
Yeah, where we work on our watershed, there's 5 different law enforcement agencies that are active. So when we're talking about homeless encampments, it really matters where, because we're talking about different jurisdictions, all that kind of stuff. It's a big, that definitely does matter. So that's a good point.
So I have a question, maybe for my clarification, but we seem to be talking about, with several of these questions, about maybe the difference between the effectiveness of city stormwater programs versus kind of the gross trash that's coming in from elsewhere. And so how is it important to separate the two, and how do we do that, or are they kind of commingled?
It kind of seems like the big overarching question that we were talking about a lot is that pink question that we have there on the right, the how much is evading management. Yeah. and then that like might be question number 1, and then some of these other ones are sort of assuming that the answer is a lot, then these other things are our questions.
Yeah, so if we jump to that question on the right, then I think you're right, Sarah. We're basically implicitly assuming here that one component of the what and the where is trash coming from municipalities that just gets by whatever measures are in place.
Yeah.
And I like the addition of the where, because when I read this question, I just implicit in my reading of it was aware, but that's not actually true, right? If you say homeless encampments are an important source, well, that doesn't mean that you know exactly where geographically that
Right.
trash is coming from. So I think that's relevant.
Yeah, and it definitely speaks to the second question. Is it homeless encampments that are under a highway and are being washed through a storm drain, or introducing debris from a storm drain, or are we talking about encampments that are downstream of those storm drains in the resource itself?
So what's the use case for this one then? Given this question, how much trash is coming out of cities? It seems like a similar. Okay, I can think of a little bit different use case. Our first one we were talking about, like a lot of these use case responses, I think we're largely talking about municipal actions, stormwater programs, other departments within a city that would have the capacity to either do some prevention or response to the problem. But now it's almost like we've come up in scale to a regional scale, and we want to understand what the contributions are downstream from the city relative to other potential sources. Who like it kind of like Kate was saying, the who is sort of a useful construct to figure out what the use case is. Who's most interested in addressing that question?
I mean, a lot of these, I feel like it's the watchdog organizations, not the municipalities, because it's going to be very expensive to deal with this. But I mean, that's kind of what it comes to is the water boards and the NGOs that are going to be saying the current trash amendments or the current whatever is not capturing everything that we intended to capture in the interest of water quality.
And in order,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, so in order to prioritize who the watchdogs need to go after or where the focus is, we need to understand this question, and then we can sort of focus that action and understand which municipality to focus on.
Right. I mean, it seems like the people in this group are all in agreement that the answer to this is that there's a lot that is leaking and evading management. So it's more just a matter, the use case is quantifying it so that we can get appropriate response.
And
And
yeah,
so
I see this question is really about establishing the baseline and like understanding the overall health. Like it's much more holistic than the others. And it has to require, I think as we're getting at with the who, right? Municipalities are like, it's not my jurisdiction, I don't have to handle it. But among all of the players, like finding out who should be responsible is a big piece.
Yeah, I think another use case for this is certainly from the municipality side is alternative compliance.
Yeah.
So kind of as there's the priority land uses, what we kind of think of as the traditional high trash generating areas. But if there's a system for identifying, areas for whatever reason that end up being trash generating areas that are kind of out of the traditional realm, what are the, that kind of sets up next steps for, employing trash capture methods that are going to generate equal or even greater benefit than just kind of putting a full capture system next to a retail center or something like that.
Yeah, those are good. The wording is subtly different from the previous question, but it definitely has a different sort of a use case. And even in this language, like, this is similar to what we said over here, prioritize where to focus response, but it's a very different kind of response. It's a little bit less direct, right? It's where to focus your response in terms of getting cities or counties or other permittees to do what they need to do rather than directly implementing actions if it is somebody at the regional or state regulator level that's using that information.
It seems like they both have the accountability factor. That's kind of what we're getting at.
Mm-hmm.
Initiating response, right? Like prioritizing almost implies that we're already covering those areas, but it's also about getting to the areas that aren't covered with a new response.
Yeah. Can we jump quadrants back down to? Well, I think we did a pretty good job on this one, but now that our gears are greased here, our current trash reduction efforts having an appreciable effect. The first one that comes to mind for me is a city stormwater manager wants to know if their program is effective or not. Right. But I'm sure there's others.
I mean, it seems like that's the provide feedback about any of the actions that we were talking about before is, you know, if the answer is no, then do something else. And if the answer is yes, then, you know, justify the investment.
Yeah, similar to the last one, I can definitely see this one kind of tying into NGOs, watchdog organizations, you know, kind of understanding if there are, you know, gaps in effective deployment, you know, kind of where those are and what the implications are in terms of, you know, volume or downstream impacts, things like that. You know, this kind of seems like an important thing in the toolbox for people working with regulators and municipalities.
This could definitely be the public education, informed public education part as well.
I think it's going to be critical for the NGOs to be involved at this point. I mean, if you look at you know, the trash amendments, the track one folks, once they've installed their full capture devices, they're done. They don't have to do any monitoring or anything. The track two have to do monitoring and make sure they're comparable with track one. But how do you know if you're comparable with track one if you're not monitoring track one as well?
Yeah. The $1 million question, like we said, right? This is where the rubber meets the road on a lot of how we perceive the value of all this work.
Yeah.
Okay, those are great. Now we're going down a little bit more granular with this question. What types of trash, materials-based probably, reduction should be prioritized for aquatic system health in California? I feel like this is pretty closely related to the talk that Scott just gave us about understanding degrees of effect and toxicity for various organisms, and that range of effects that exists for different material types. Who's the most critical user for this sort of information? I feel like Scott gave us a clue in that presentation.
Regulators at a broad level.
Yeah, if you're going to set a standard for, if you're going to set a line where there's an exceedance threshold, well, gosh, understanding what levels of toxicity relative to volume-based or mass-based measurements are, that seems like pretty critical information.
I think also about like, how do regulators decide how aggressively managed the trash should be? Like what levels of leakage are okay? I mean, ideally there would be nothing, but like how do we get from the unknowable huge amount to something less that has minimal impact on both people and waterways? Like even understanding this area of trash probably has this type of effect on this ecosystem and how that changes with different materials or volumes.
Yeah.
I think this one may also kind of inform, you know, a decentralized versus centralized approach. you know, kind of once you get an understanding of that, you know, materials reduction and kind of get that baseline that you mentioned, that standard, it kind of can then lead to discussions on, you know, whether that's, you know, money is better spent towards a single kind of large downstream system, or, you know, a number of smaller, you know, either less or more effective, you know, kind of individual treatment systems.
Yeah, those all seem relevant. Any other thoughts on the use case for this one? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking outside regulators, so not just trash or municipal regulators, but also fishery regulators or federal, I don't know, Fish and Wildlife that works on amphibians and other things that live in the aquatic system.
That's a good point. We keep saying regulators, just as though it's only a specific type. How about the other one I could think of would be just for people doing policy advocacy, right? If, for instance, you know, we identify that a specific set of products or types of materials are particularly problematic for causing habitat degradation, like, you know, for instance, I mean, the biggest success story is probably copper in brake pads, right? Understanding the degree of toxicity in urban waterways associated with copper helps drive those folks doing policy advocacy towards getting copper out of brake pads, and that's something that, you know, we can measure that change over time. You know, we know now that there's a substantial component, or one of the most important components of toxicity in waterways proximity to urban systems is tire particles from wear, right? That could, I mean, that's a problem that's just only recently been identified, that you could definitely envision a similar process occurring, advocacy for changes in materials to once the primary contributor to a problem is identified, it sets the stage for people that work at higher levels of advocacy to start driving towards those changes in the materials that can affect those habitat impacts, improve them. All right. Well, I feel like we've got to look for our use cases. There's a lot of different concepts mixed together in some of our use cases there. But I feel like all these concepts are important. I think some of them are, when we start putting all of these together in a chain, some of these are going to fall out into different categories that are probably more defined than just what we're calling a use case right now. So I think it's okay that they're capturing a pretty broad range of concepts at the moment, just as long as we get them on the board here. How about data types? If we go back up to the first quadrant. And obviously we can identify lots of different data types that would be useful, just like the previous problem we had with identifying barriers. I think the most useful way to proceed is to try to think about a limited amount of resources, what would be the most useful data type to collect for addressing this question on the scale and the kind of use case that we've defined?
For that one, it seems like we're looking for volumetric data that is geographically mapped, right?
It does.
So
Coarse measurement, volumetric. What do we call
yeah,
it?
I think it's quantitative in the other.
Qualitative, volumetric.
Or quantitative, right? If we're talking, well, I guess we're just talking about relative source, so I guess it doesn't have to be, but.
Yeah, we're kind of talking about these qualitative volumetric. Oh, no. Okay, I'm sorry.
I think it's.
We have this one down here, volume. This is associated with the volume, but
it doesn't get to source. Yeah.
But Shelley, on this one, this is identification of specific items, correct? This tier 3. So that's all I'm wondering is that the sort of data that we're talking about, right? So we're talking about being able to quantify how much is coming from where, say throughout an entire city.
Right.
Are you able to actually identify the volume and the item types that compose that volume?
Right.
It seems that quantitative is important to be able to make comparisons across disparate places. Like the qualitative seems like it just gets fuzzier to say it's really better, it's really worse.
Yeah.
I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday because like that's what our organization does is we try to attribute source when we're in the field, and I think Shelley was pointing out that that's an imperfect. You know, it's asking people to be subjective, make a subjective determination in the field, which is not. It's hard to be comparable. So. I mean, I find that for our program, it seems to work pretty well for us, but I take her point for sure that it's, especially on a statewide level, it's a tricky thing to do. Because we do want to get at source.
Right.
Maybe if we had, maybe that's another piece of metadata that could be collected in addition to the quantitative volumetric tier 3 that she had on there. It could have a layer of metadata where they have like checkboxes where they can select both specific item descriptions as well as this, you know, granted subjective type. The River Park Foundation map does that, and that's really all the data we collect is by source because ours is used to inform all these kind of management priorities, but we don't have the data that is in that tier 3 thing. So maybe
can you give us an example of what sources are specified again, Sarah, just to remind us?
Yeah, we do active encampment, inactive encampment, stormwater, dumping, litter, hazardous material. I think that's it. Okay. I feel like I'm forgetting one. Special removal. We have that's like if it's concrete or something that's going to take a backhoe.
Yeah.
But that's because we're just talking about informing how do we get it out of there, not so much some of the other stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah, even just the concept of source is a little tricky in and of itself, right? Because what you just indicated was a way of doing data collection where you explicitly specify source of a certain type, right? Kind of where it's being generated from, but you could also specify source in a more granular way, right? If you're talking about plastic bottles or something, you could specify that as the, local convenience store or something as the source.
Right, right. I mean, I think if we're trying to say how did it arrive in the waterway, I mean, I think that's kind of what we're talking about, right? For this thing is, how did it get there? Then it matters whether it's, I mean, I guess that's a question. Maybe, I don't know if maybe people in this group matters whether it's tobacco product or whether it's plastic or whether it's, you know, clothing, versus I'm talking about source, like it's related to homelessness, it's related to illegal dumping, it's related to some other problem that needs to be addressed. And those kind of are two separate questions that both matter.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's both qualitative and quantitative, because if I look at when we're talking about source just in our particular project, if we're looking at illegal dumping, our plan is to do drone flights to take images, which is going to be qualitative. And then we can say, this is not coming from the stormwater. This is obviously an illegal dump. But I think both quantitative and qualitative data is important, because there are sort of different questions about what does source mean.
Yeah. Our data always ends up with a map of like, okay, well, this property is obviously a stormwater collection point because we have 40 stormwater icons that are all showing up in this spot, as opposed to areas under a freeway often have many encampment related icons, and it kind of helps decide those kind of management, which is obviously very different than what you're talking about.
Yeah, Sarah, our program does that too. When we're doing our observational data collection at our field sites, we have essentially categories. So we have trash, and then we identify specific types of trash that we see most often. So like bottles, cans, plastic bags, small litter, things like that. And then we have a separate category for human impact. So like homelessness type of things. So tents, toilet paper, sleeping bags, clothes, you know, feces, things like that. So we kind of do categorical qualitative, but we also will, you know, tally mark some of those more prevalent trash types, I guess. So yeah, it's both. It really is. It's both.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Given our use cases that we've specified, I kind of fuzzed it up with what source means, I guess. But given these use cases that we've specified, those ones that you were describing, Sarah, of like sort of what element in the city can we respond to illegal dumping, homeless encampments? That seems like given this use case, that seems like the most relevant way to define source that directs us to our data type.
Yeah, trying to get, I mean, if the goal of if the use cases that we're talking about are informing intervention, then trying to have the field data collection focus on somebody having to take a stab at what is the issue. I'm gonna I'll plop our data map in the chat in case anybody wants to look at it.
Gary, real quick, it almost sounds like, you know, what we're talking about here is the transport mechanism, and you know, I mean, I think that's a key attribute if we're looking to inform strategy implementation, because you know, if we can make you know, some sort of assumption on the transport mechanism, whether, you know, that's stormwater or it was brought, you know, physically brought into the water body and is associated with an encampment, or wind blown, you know, I mean, because there's obviously different strategies that you're gonna look to address the source, depending on what that transport mechanism, or what you think that transport mechanism is.
That's a great way to summarize it, Grant. I think that's really, I think if that's the action you're trying to inform, I think that's a great way to summarize that.
Yeah, I mean, because like if you know, if you're seeing a bunch of, you know, windblown trash, and it's, you know, you can link it back to you know, fast food place nearby, you know, the strategy is pretty easy there. They got to tighten up their trash management on site. You know, if it's getting blown out of dumpsters or trash cans, things like that, that's a easy kind of an easy use case. But it gets much more complex if the transport mechanism is, you know, via the stormwater, the storm drain infrastructure, or if, you know, and then obviously with the encampments, it's gets pretty complex.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. That sort of gets at an element of this that, you know, we sliced it along those lines of those different data type tiers, but the other dimension is like, well, how are you recording these data? Do you know exactly where you're recording, how much was where? Because if you don't do that, well, it's not going to help you understand, and probably other elements of ancillary data or metadata that you record with your measurement will help you get at that transport mechanism or proximal source. You need to say, I'm just going to write relevant metadata. That's why this is difficult, I think. It's because we have a structure like this that is a really useful way to divide these data types, but just doesn't get at exactly all the things that we need to know about the different data types.
Yeah, this is not easy at all. This is I almost want to run back to the data dashboard group. They seem to have a much easier challenge, even though theirs is not easy by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, this one ties your brains in knots a little bit.
Yeah, this is definitely a tough one.
It seems like there's the question, both the way Melissa answered the question and the way Sarah answered the question suggests that the question requires two types of data. So a research level with so Sarah's answer was start with tier 1 data and then move to tier 3. But Melissa was talking about specific objects at the encampments or what was being done. I'm sorry, I don't totally remember, but it seemed to say that she was starting at tier 4, like a subsample, some sampling of tier 4. And then based on that, there's another layer of research that needs to be done. So she was saying there was water bottles or clothes, and then, which is very specific, and then moving up from there. I don't know. So it seems like a question you can tackle either from the bottom up, like you do a sampling, which people do when they go out and beach cleanup or whatever, something like that, or waterway cleanup. What you have is you have tier 4 data coming in, and then and from that, looking at different volumes within that, proportions within that, then you can gather the relative source data with a different tier of data. But it either or, in Sarah's case, I'm sorry, I'm spacing on it now. She said volume. She started at volume. It just seems like it's a 2-part question.
Yeah. So it's like we're stratifying the data collection. Stratified collection. It's like stratified and iterative. You use more detailed data. Tell me if I'm capturing this correctly, Malati. You use the more detailed data collection. Obviously, you can't do this everywhere, right? It takes more time, more resources. You get more information for sure, but that just means you can't do it everywhere. But you can get some clues from this information that would inform how you might go about a data collection approach that you could do more frequently with wider coverage up in these higher tiers. Is that
Sure. Yes.
okay. So I've just written stratified iterative data collection, higher tiers inform, lower tier, more detailed. Let's just say more detailed informs less detailed with wider coverage. We'll get into sort of this. We're kind of verging into the kind of experimental design specifications here, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail down the road. So
you
that's
know what,
yeah.
I was just going to say that we've talked a lot about the use cases that are more about the kind of managers that are dealing specifically with water quality and this kind of thing. But I think that part of the reason we talked about this question is because we're making the assumption there's also probably law enforcement and like code compliance and other like not water quality sphere people are going to need to be involved in addressing some of the sources that we've been talking about. And so some of the use cases also like things that are not so in the weeds with this type of data, that they're like usable by other like departments and other like stakeholders for some of this stuff. I know I talked about homeless outreach providers, and we certainly talked about law enforcement. And I know with illegal dumping, I'm sure there's some kind of environmental services or something that would also need to be using this data, potentially using this data.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sarah, and I think that just speaks to the next link in the chain, a couple down from data collection, how you synthesize the data up and develop them into products that are meaningful for those audiences that are going to be required to understand them to either change behavior or put policy actions in place to incentivize those changes.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sarah. I would even extend that to some of the businesses in whether it's the waste haulers. We deal a lot with property management companies when it comes to trash issues, especially where there's multiple tenants in one property. Because it does no good to go after one tenant if they're all sharing, one common waste receptacle. So, commercial property management companies, the waste haulers,
right.
There's a lot of private entities too that could benefit from this information.
Yeah. I know our data is currently used by homeless outreach or like nonprofits, by environmental services with the city, with the municipalities, with park rangers and wardens from the state, and by PD, the PD hot team. Like there's a lot of different groups that are not like in the traditional water quality environment sector that are accessing data. Which I think is why some of it is, for our purposes, having it be not very, like having some subjective categories that everybody understands is useful, even though it's not necessarily as valuable from a data standpoint as the kind of mechanism, the different types of tiers that are in that other slide.
Yeah, whatever type of data collected, they need to be synthesized up to a place where it's useful for making those decisions, or why you're collecting the data, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Sarah, is this map available publicly?
Yeah, that one I just linked is our live version. There is some metadata that's hidden behind a password, specifically related to active encampments. But the link that I sent is the public link.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have a colleague at the county, and I know that they do something similar, but again, like you had mentioned, it's really kind of internal for them for like emergency services, knowing if there's, you know, various services that need to be visiting some of these places, especially the active ones. So maybe I can chat with you again after this in more detail about. Okay, thanks.
We're working on a layer. We're having a big storm event this tonight and tomorrow, and so a lot of these areas are gonna get flooded, and we're working on a layer that will overlay water level, because we have a gauge on the river, so we can use that to show which of the sites will be flooded, which is going to be helpful for us for resurvey to update data, but also for homeless outreach groups to know how to prioritize trying to get people out of harm's way. It's kind of interesting to see all the different layers that you can overlay on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And also a bummer, because it might be make us able to capture how many millions of volumes of pounds of trash are going to be underwater. But
yeah, but that's useful, right? Like
knowing how much is a good thing.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I know we've talked about this in the larger scope of things too, but informing the people that can do something about it, you know, like really bringing that attention to the level it needs to get to take action. So yeah, I'm excited to talk to you more about this.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, Sarah, as we get to the point after lunch when we're looking at creating tools and data products to, you know, actually make use of that data, maybe we can even pop that up on the screen as an example to sort of get our imaginations going.
Sure.
That sounds great. We've got about 15 minutes before before lunch.
Oh my gosh.
I think time flies when you're talking trash. So we want to try to fill out the rest of these quadrants with data types. Now we're over in how much trash volume is leaking into waterways, evading management. So we're kind of like downstream from municipal boundaries and want to understand. The wording right now is how much trash, how much volume seems to indicate us towards one of these data types.
And maybe that should be reworded, because you know, it goes back to what trash is more important than other trash, right? So, you know, when I see a bunch of EPS floating down into the ocean, it's more of a concern than somebody's chair floating down into the ocean. So, you know, I don't know if that should be reworded.
But I think that's also in our bottom right question is, I think those are two separate questions, right?
Yeah, that one gets at that more, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
So you're standing next to a receiving water or a set of receiving waters draining from municipalities, and we want to know how much is coming from that city upstream that didn't get managed properly. Not an easy thing to know.
Tier 1.
Right, Tier 1.
It seems like it might also be, so we need to know the spatial info, or the like geospatial. So it needs to be able to get at what is it evading, which, you know, both jurisdiction, who is the permittee, but also like, is it evading a stormwater or like a storm drain somehow, or is it originating elsewhere?
It's sort of the same as what Grant said, right? Like understanding the transport mechanism.
Yeah. But I think the key here is that it's evading management, right? So what management thing is it evading? That's probably part of it.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, there's lots of data out there about what gets collected from the I guess the drainage infrastructure from, I would say the transportation, between the transportation and the drainage infrastructure, there's lots of data about what gets collected, through street sweeping, through catch basin maintenance, things like that. But we don't really know, what isn't being collected through those efforts. It's easy to sit here and say, gosh, if, scheduling plays such a key role here, because you might have the most effective trash capture devices in the world in all of your inputs into the storm drain system. But if you're not getting around and cleaning them when they're full, then they just get bypassed. So it's, there's so many variables here when you're thinking about what could be evading, all of the different management efforts, because it's a combination of structural and non-structural. So, you can make assumptions about structural, but the effectiveness of the structural is so dependent on the non-structural activities and the scheduling and all of that this becomes this is definitely one to really think about. I'm struggling to wrap my head around it.
This might be one because of the scale of how much is not being captured. We're doing some sort of qualitative as the precursor to define where we need to do quantitative would be useful. Because if you just could do lots of fast visual assessments that are not that detailed, it might help identify areas where doing the more detailed volumetric analysis would be faster, would be worth the time.
Yeah, just real quick, I don't want to take up more time, but a couple years ago, we were curious about just how much debris might be entering into the storm drain system through catch basins. So we partnered up with a company called eCube that makes these relatively low cost ultrasonic sensors, and they stuck a couple of these sensors in. They use the sensors in their primary client is waste haulers. They put the sensors in trash bins so that they know when the trash bins are full, then their drivers go out and pick up the dumpsters. And we were thinking, well, maybe we could do the same thing with catch basins to get an idea of how quickly they fill up with debris and when they fill up with debris. We didn't get very good data, but it turns out the sensors are not ideal for catch basins because they don't really cover the full extent of, if you've got a 12-foot long catch basin, it's really hard to cover the full extent of it. But I was surprised, what data we did get from that. I was surprised at how quickly debris accumulates in catch basins during storm events, or even sometimes, non-storm events. It was very quickly accumulating.
Well, that's another way to think about it, I think, Grant. Like because you could think about it as like, if you're downstream of an MS4 or something, as like your validation approach to what you think about how much is actually escaping. But if you know something about the capacity of everything that you have,
Right.
You know something about how much is accumulating on the streets, something about the capacity cumulatively of all those devices. Well, those sorts of measurements you're talking about, you could use to estimate how much ends up getting by. So you can look at it from the other way.
I think that's what we're looking at here is, it somewhat becomes kind of a modeling exercise.
So we're saying, I'm trying to figure out how to capture what you just said.
Yeah.
Estimate much is like bypass it. Capture via, yeah, it's like a modeling exercise. It's like modeling informed by measurements.
I mean, that's just one transportation mechanism. It's not accounting for other, transport mechanisms, not accounting for illegal dumping, encampments, and other pathways.
Okay, we got a bit to chew on there. We will revisit on that one. Thanks for all those contributions. That is great. If we move down to this other quadrant on our left, current trash reduction efforts having an appreciable effect. Basically, are our programs effective? We're sort of, every time we're talking about data types, but we keep getting into these experimental design elements, which is great because you need both, right? You can't, they don't exist in isolation from one another. So similar thinking on this is useful. How do we know that a degree of trash problem existed at time 1 in a certain location and it got better or it got worse at time 2? Which data types of what we have available would be most amenable to addressing that question?
I mean, it seems like it needs to be something that's fairly comprehensive if we're trying to measure overall efficacy. So it's got to be something that's reasonable to do on a comprehensive scale and that can show delta over like multiple time sampling.
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, it's a little tricky, right? Because take Shelley's plastic bag ban example. Well, you can certainly use that more detailed data. That's the only kind of data that's useful for indicating the efficacy of that ban. But like you're saying, Sarah, it's probably not something that you're going to be able to make a statement about the overall change in trash conditions throughout your city.
Right. I mean, this one might just be a kind of thing where we have to recommend that they need to, what is the specific management action they're trying to evaluate? Is it overall trash reduction, like in the entire, giant watershed? That's a very different thing than are we trying to evaluate like the efficacy of this specific municipal code that is meant to address illegal dumping or something like that, or some sort of.
Yeah.
Because I think you're right, like the bag ban, you'd have to do the real specific to your data collection to show any efficacy there. But if we're trying to do just big general.
It's like specific item or policy based efficacy. Well, you're probably going to be down into tier 3 and 4 because it's going to relate to item types.
Yeah. Or if you're looking at a really small geographic area, you could conceivably do the tier 3 and 4 too. If you're looking at management of like a specific preserve or something like that.
Yeah. Five minutes left. Can we fill out our last quadrant in 5 minutes? What types of trash? Okay, so now we're into materials should be prioritized, and this is really specific for aquatic system health. So we're talking specifically about impacts in the environment that we can measure via toxicity or other responses in the benthos or the vegetation, etc. Data types.
This seems like more biological and chemical sampling as opposed to trash data. Potentially.
Yeah.
Looking at IBI and.
Suppose if we had to put a tier, it would be what, tier 4? Because you have to know what's there to know if it's causing a problem.
It feels like you would need the two in concert with one another, right? You certainly need those biological and chemical data, and then to draw the connection between where those constituents may be coming from and the relative contribution of those constituents. You need that tier 4 trash data.
One of the things that came to mind with this was some of the, at least we've got an investigative order for some of the fecal coliforms and where those contributors are coming from. And that is sort of outside of the scope of this. And I just wanted to raise if that was intentional, if we're talking about public health as well as, like, are we talking here about ecosystem health when we wrote this question, or were we talking also about some of the like public health concerns related to kind of similar things?
That's a good question.
I think that wouldn't, I think some of that stuff wouldn't float to the top if we're really talking about like ecosystem health. Probably float to the top is kind of a gross way to say that considering what we're talking about, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, did you mean that literally?
I know. Sorry for that visual, guys.
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't, given the phrasing that we currently have in the question, I was hedging more towards ecosystem health,
yeah.
But it could be either.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. I just wasn't, it hadn't really popped into my head, the distinction, until now.
Yeah, that's a great point of clarification.
I mean, this is one of the first ones where we might be talking about marine, like specifically ocean habitats, as opposed to just like, I know a lot of this we've been talking about riparian, you know, everything in between. So there might be some marine collection or data collection we're talking about here too.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I mean, because the prioritization might actually, it might actually be influenced by, you know, what aquatic system are you, is it your goal to protect? So if you, yeah, I mean, if you're talking coastal ocean aquatic health, you know, the priority types of trash might be a little bit different than if you're talking inland surface water ecosystem health.
Yeah, okay, and so that would tell us what types, right? What types of habitat where the data were collected for those biological and chemical measurements would be relevant for connecting up with the trash data to indicate that. We need to know where those data were collected.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Some
Well,
of
that
this
was
also
really
might
great,
be
you guys. Sorry?
I was just going to say some of this might be a data review because a lot of the toxicity stuff is known already.
Mhm.
I mean, whether or not that trash is present may or not be known, but some, you know, a lot of these studies exist already.
Yeah, I feel like it basically we're talking about what Scott was presenting this morning, that level of meta-analysis of those studies that have already been done. We're not talking about somebody going out to collect those measurements on the fly,
right,
to address this. Yeah. Great point. So in terms of that part, it's more like the data products and tools would be where we might identify that gap that's currently being filled by products like Scott's developing. Okay, that was great, everybody. I don't want to cut into lunch here. We're at 12:02, so we can break and reconvene at 1 o'clock, where we're going to get into some of these experimental design elements in more detail as we start putting the pieces together. That was a fantastic conversation. Looking forward to another one after lunch.
Great job, Gary.
Sure thing.
Thanks.
Thank
See you
you.
in a bit. Okay, I'll pop my screen up again just to see where we left off. Everybody seeing my screen?
Now I am.
All the brilliant ideas that we exploded all over it during the last couple of hours. We're going to be drilling down into, we didn't get to the heart of decisions on some of these concepts regarding the data collection approach and experimental design, but that's okay because we're going to be drilling down and specifying in a little bit more granular fashion for each of those. So it's great to have these ideas to start drawing from. And I think we're going to do a little bit of heads down time during this round. So we have 4 questions, right? And we've sort of, we've got a good sense of all of our ideas, I think, and perspectives just from doing this exercise. But I think what we want to do as we lay out individual elements is we will we'll kind of divide into groups and work through each of those. I mean, it's not really groups because we only have one room to talk in, but maybe folks that are more interested in one question or another, you could just pick that question and spend time on that particular board. And Shelley, you and I can go to different boards and help, you know, sort of guide folks through that process. As we're talking through this, I'm really wondering, Shelley, once the playbook comes out, how much overlap conceptually between what we're about to do is going to exist between this and what's going to be included in the playbook. So I'm really interested to see that. And what's the date that it's to be coming out? Or
I'm pretty sure it'll be out no later than March. I'm hopeful that it'll come out next month.
Cool. Well, that's great. It almost feels as though there will be something more concrete to reference back to and check our intuitions for where we get to at the end of today, looking back at some of that work. So this is my idea for what we want to try to get to. It's really just a more granular look at what we've been doing in somewhat holistic fashion in throwing out our intuitions, ideas, concerns, and areas of focus for each of these elements. We started with the management questions, and those are driven by a decision-making need, whoever the stakeholders are, what they're worried most about. We've done that part. That's done. What we haven't done quite yet, and that's part of why it stayed nebulous, I think, in some of the other discussion, is that we haven't quite narrowed those down to what might be testable hypotheses or a manner of inference or a type of inference you're hoping to get to. So it can be either of those things, right? You can decide that you want to test how important one factor is versus another factor, or test that one area provides a more important contribution than another area. We can collect data in a way to test those things. Or the formal structure could be a design to gain inference. For instance, structure the sample of your data collection such that it's appropriate for making inference over a wider spatial area, right? That would be one goal from that. We've covered a lot of these elements of experimental design just because we can't help getting into them when we're talking about data types and questions. And the things that I've listed here, and these are just sort of the general descriptors of the things that we're going to actually specify for each of our questions. This is just to get the wheels turning before we all launch in and do some heads down on each of the question boards. Obviously, we have to talk about the setting or the venue in which the data is being collected. You have to narrow it generally, right? A number of people that was part of our user case specification. You're going to come up with a different approach if you're talking about riparian systems, marine ecosystems, the city storm drain network and what's coming out of the outfall. So it really helps to specify what that setting is, and that also helps you go down the line and identify what the appropriate spatial density and coverage might be, the time frequency for observation to get at what you need to know. Statistical power, so the statistical power is your probability of not being in error in rejecting a null hypothesis, or a hypothesis that, for instance, things are not different. I want the data to have an appropriate amount of statistical power so that when I say, yes, they are different, that I'm able to not be in error in making that determination up to a certain level of confidence. So these are just, we don't have to get into the technical aspects of each of these, but these are the concepts that we want to have in mind as we're stepping through each of these steps. And all of these things bring trade-offs, right? In this experimental design, we just tripped over them as we were going through it before, wherein if you want more detail in your data, if you want to know more about specific item types and use that, for instance, as a mean for specifying the sources that they're coming from, well, you're probably going to be able to make less frequent observations or have less spatial coverage. And that's just always going to be the case. And so the trick is to try to optimize that trade-off for the purpose that the data are being collected for, and that loops back to the management question and your scale of inference. Data collection, I didn't have access here before I added this because it occurred to me in our discussions earlier that, well, sometimes we're talking about going out and collecting your own data, but certainly in other situations, those data have already been collected. Like we were talking this morning about those toxicity data, and having that meta level analysis was probably the most useful data to have around. So that what that level of access is, if it exists, if it doesn't exist, what the source that you would draw those data from, if it's going to be original data collection, what's the platform or mechanism for data collection. We've talked about just manual surveys, app-based data capture, capture via imagery, vehicle-mounted cameras, capture via drones. Again, with all these questions, there's going to be different ways, different platforms that you could use to capture those data. And so it's not like one of them is wrong. We're just trying to capture which one is most amenable to the way in which we're thinking about addressing this question, given the user case that we specified. And then what sort of feeds also into the data collection process and the experimental design is how you intend to analyze the data, what specific statistical methods to be used, hypothesis testing, whether or not you need to worry about levels of confidence associated with any inferential statements that you might make that come from your conclusions from the data analysis. Or the flip side of that is how much uncertainty is acceptable. Is it important to be able to quantify that uncertainty? Scott gave a great example of that this morning when he showed that graph with toxicity distribution, and given the fact that they have lots of different data sources, they were able to calculate a confidence interval around that line. And so that's important, because if you want to test the hypothesis, the degree of precision to which you're able to specify that effect it's going to bear on your capacity to be able to test that hypothesis, right? Less precise, more fuzzy, you have a little bit lesser capacity. And then the fun part, this came up a whole bunch this morning. What do you make out of all this, right? What data products do you produce that are going to help people make better decisions? Who are the audiences that it needs to get to? And what types of formats and communication venues need to happen to make those data meaningful? Is it a map? Is it a technical report that an expert can review? Is it a way of communicating that's amenable to public education and outreach to people that aren't technical experts at all? All those things contribute to whether or not those data products are going to be useful to do what we need them to do to make wiser decisions about trash. So what I thought we would do, let me stop there. That was a bunch of talking. Let me stop just on this descriptive one, see if there's any questions. So we're getting a little bit more technical now. We've been pretty high level conceptual, but we're forcing it to become a little bit more technical now to hopefully make the end product a little bit more useful. Some of these descriptors probably seem a little bit vague just at the moment. They, just like in the previous exercise, as we get into actually trying to define them for specific questions, that's usually what prompts, you know, sort of the conflicts of understanding and forcing us to confront whatever semantic issues we have or actual logistical differences in terminology. So what I thought we'd do is split up and have people work on individual boards in this way. I'll provide an example first. We specify each of these elements, and then after that, we want to come back and determine, okay, of each of these steps along the way to getting to that useful data product, where are the weakest links right now? Given, I mean, we don't know everything about what's out there, but I think the people in this room know a fair bit about the different types of designs and data and products that are out there. And we're just going to mark them in red if we perceive these to be the biggest holes in, or the biggest gaps in this link of the chain to getting to those data products. And I feel like we've already talked about it a fair bit. For some of these questions, certainly, it just came up this morning, the existence of these data products, even if these monitoring data are collected, you could get all the way to the end here, and if these data products don't get created or they're not accessible to the relevant audiences, it's like you fell down right at the finish line. It just didn't go all the way to making it relevant for those people that need the information. So maybe this will help. We'll step through the example for question 1, and then I will let you loose on the rest of the questions, as well as to edit this one. I just scribbled these in while we're on the break, but it's only one perspective. It's just mine, so it would benefit from your all's contributions. So this is our upper left quadrant question. What are the relative source contributions of trash in waterways? I started trying to step through this. The only way I could do it was to specify a particular scale at which I was addressing this question. So we got at this in the earlier exercise a little bit. So I just said the municipal scale. That's going to be the universe across which this question is being addressed. And one testable hypothesis or inference that we touched on earlier, illegal dumping contributes more trash than urban litter to waterways, right? And being able to answer or test that hypothesis might inform that management question in a way that helps you prioritize areas for action, allocate resources more efficiently. For the experimental design, this is where it gets a little bit tough. We want to compare the volumes of trash available for transport to waterways before capture in each of these two different types of venues. That means when data are collected, we have to know if these are just trash that are sitting ready to get transported into the storm drain system, or they're associated with illegal dumping. That's probably going to mean walking around in different places, either on the streets or places where illegal dumping has been known to occur in the past. You know, usually that's down by an embankment or a riparian area. We do it at urban drainage scale, so all the water that we know that is coming into a certain urban drainage. So like, let me show you. So for instance, here's Watsonville. These are a bunch of trash data collected for all, oops, clicked it off. Going back to Watsonville. So all the area that's going to drain into Watsonville Slough,
Hey, Gary.
these are trash data collected there.
Hey, Gary, are we supposed to see something different than the slide?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Thanks, Shelley, for alerting me. Let's see. Let me try that again. How about, do you see a map now?
I can see it.
I do, yeah.
Okay, it was just a little bit of lag, I think. So this is an example. This is nice because it's a drainage, right? Like all the water that's draining to the Watsonville Slough is in this area. Water that comes from over here goes somewhere else. It doesn't go down into the slough. So we have an outlet at an outfall so that we know how much is actually going to that location. So that's the scale I've specified. I specified this qualitative volumetric tier 1 style data collection. Seems like a difficult problem to address. So I thought that this, this coarser data that we can collect more frequently would be more useful. Manual surveys with app-based data capture, as we've touched on before, the geospatial component is going to be really important, right? We need to know where precisely you're collecting the data. Are you in a place where you could really define that this is just litter on the street that came from the convenience store up the street, or the pathway of school children going to and from school, a bus stop where it's just going to be available for transport into the storm drain system, or did somebody back a truck up somewhere? That can happen on city streets too, and that's going to cause, that's going to make it more difficult, but that is one thing that's going to need to be there in the data capture, the best assessment of where that trash came from, dumping or just urban litter. Oops, sorry, that's in there. For the analysis, we want to characterize the spatiotemporal patterns of trash accumulation from litter and dumping, identify the degree to which sources are distinguishable, that's what I was just talking about. And if we're able to do that, we want to test the differences between those two source contributions to the best that we've been able to measure them based on our qualitative estimates of trash volume. What we want to get out of this, that might be the most useful products for decision makers would be, well, this is where I thought, Sarah, it sounds like the map that you described sounds something like what I've written here, maps of dumping and litter accumulation. If there's many observations, that's to be summarized over some time period. So I just said 3-month intervals with a color ramp that indicates trash hotspots, so that you would have 3 pieces of information on such a map, where the trash is coming from, whether it's dumping, whether it's urban litter, because those would probably require 2 different types of solutions, and what the magnitude of that problem is. And let me just show you guys another. So this is an example. This doesn't have this map. This is for City of Watsonville. This doesn't. You guys are seeing a map right now? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
This doesn't discern between those different source types, but it's the same idea. It's a way to, whatever drainage you're interested in, sum up those observations over a period of time and identify which areas on this map, the darker purple areas, are the ones that show the most frequent and most severe litter accumulation problems over time. This data is for 2019, but you can look back at whatever year you want to see what those trends are. So this is one piece of that product that seems like it would be useful, but it doesn't discern between where the trash is coming from. And as someone pointed out this morning, that's really going to be important for deciding how management actions are affected. Okay, so that was it. That was my first draft attempt at running through this process, and I think we'd revisit this and collectively decide where all the weak links in the chain are. I created a space to pop up some examples, and maybe I'll put those maps up there. And if there's any other examples, like your map in particular, Sarah, that would be a useful example, what I'd like to do is set us all loose on these different questions and see how we go with defining each of these components that leads to those data products. How does that sound? Sounds like chaos. So I made slides. Everybody, oh, I should check. Everybody has the link to the slide deck? I can just make sure. It's in the email that that Ross sent out to the group. Just send a message if you don't, or on the chat if you don't have access to that slide deck. I see a couple of people hopping around in individual slides. Perfect. And so whichever question that grabs you, or whichever questions that grab you, start trying to step through this process and look back at these sort of general descriptors. This example, please feel free to edit this one on this first management question. And we will reconvene. Let's take 20 minutes to start going through these, and then we'll check in again, if that sounds all right. Okay, go nuts, everybody. Also, please feel free. This is also just to spark discussion and thoughts on each of these different elements. So feel free to pipe up and discuss what your thought process is as you're defining these. Or ask questions. I realize that there's still a lot of ambiguity associated with all of these. So if you've got a question in your mind, odds are a number of the rest of us do too. Okay, nice work, everybody. I got that done. What do you think? How difficult was that?
That was a little hard to get started. So once I saw everybody else getting going, I kind of understood it a little bit better.
Yeah, this is one time I wish we were in a room with a bunch of sticky notes.
Yeah. Well, I cheated. I did it during the lunch break. So I had more time than you guys, but I found it more difficult than I guessed before I tried to start putting words in those boxes. But that is, I suppose, one of the reasons why we don't look around and find ourselves with an abundance of data and data products to address the questions in exactly the way that would be relevant for making better decisions. So that's why we're here. So I'm gonna share my screen so we can get back into discussion mode. We've got about 30 minutes left before we reconvene with the larger group. Here it comes. And so I thought what we do is kind of go through these, maybe have a chance to look at one that you didn't have time to spend any time on, and we can feel free to weigh in on any of these elements. I was just reading them as everybody was filling them out, and slightly different takes, in each one, but all of them seemed to have a logical progression, from one box to the next, and that's the whole idea. And so what I thought we would do, maybe the person that sort of led the filling out of each of these can lead the discussion, but we would try to identify some of the weakest links in the chain of getting to those data products. And so this is the one that I mostly filled out. Well, everybody just feel free to chime in here, but I think the management question is fairly well defined here. We want to know where the trash is coming from. What are those sources? Sure, there's different ways in which we can define what those sources are, but I think that the stakeholders that are interested in, they know what they're looking for. For instance, Sarah's map of the homeless encampments, that is a way to define a source that aligns with the policy response or action that they're trying to incentivize. So that tells me that the management question is fairly well defined, maybe a little bit less for the testable hypotheses that sometimes isn't as precisely defined, but I still wouldn't call it the weakest link because I think it leads pretty directly from the management question. The experimental design is probably one of those on the weaker link side of the scale. I think we go out and collect a bunch of data for various reasons to identify those sources, or for a specific set of sources to determine municipal trash compliance. But there's no overall experimental design in operation right now to provide us with the answer to this question. Sometimes at municipal level, certainly not at the regional level. Maybe you could find a few examples. Maybe San Francisco Bay Area, you could define a few examples and make that case. Data collection, it feels like there's a lot of data collection going on out there. I don't feel, we can always have more, but I don't feel like that is necessarily one of the weakest links in the chain. I'm actually I'm gonna color grade it here, so I'm gonna make that one kind of a pinkish one. I think one of the weakest parts here is in the use of the data, in the interpretation of the data for the specific purpose that we need it to be used for. So I'm going to make that one dark red. And I'm going to make data products pink again. There's a few examples out there. Sarah's got a great one that she put up here. I put a couple from Second Nature's Central Coast, trash, data analytics. But they're just pockets, and by and large, we don't have that framework to do this at regional or certainly not statewide scales. What do folks think about the way that I've graded these in terms of gappiness? Agreement, dissension?
It seems like for the data collection, it really comes down to data standardization, not the actual collection. That's really the weakness that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would classify that as a little weaker than you have it.
Like we're collecting the data, but what it really matters is, can you use it together? Because we think this is why this is the main problem here. Or let's call it, oops, let's not do that. Where'd my text one go? Oh, I lost it. There he is. I'll make that one red. Usability together. That's not very good, is it? Let's call it data compatibility, perhaps. Here's the trouble. Oh, I lost it again. Sorry. Just trying to make it so we can see that. Okay. Yeah, we've got a couple of examples there of, where we, we think where it's done right. Did you want to say anything else, Sarah, about this? About I don't know if anybody else did. I went and clicked on the map to check this out. It's a really neat application. Did you want to do any show and tell for the group, or just tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, I'm happy to. I think that the main thing is that this map is meant to be kind of a live snapshot, and the historical trends aren't captured on this portal. So we have those separately in, a million spreadsheets at the office that we can run through. But this is like our most current knowledge of what the river looks like right now. So it's a limited in the sense that it's for that specific purpose, not for trends. But all of those there's a lot of data like parcel ownership and things like that are not in the public version of the site, but the public version of the site can be used by anybody who wants to. And then we have a lot of ability to make additional reports.
So what time frame would this data that we're looking at right now, would it have been collected?
So if you click on any of the icons except for the sunshines are site no longer present. Everything else should have a date. And everything on our map at any given moment will have a date of when it was originally collected. And then in more, it'll have a time history of how many times it was confirmed still present or edited since the original date of collection. Right. So most of our sites have been confirmed within the last 4 weeks. So this one was like originally recorded at some point, but they're usually updated within 2 to 4 weeks.
And it looks like there's no kind of standard set of, it's just every item has a unique descriptor, is that right?
Yeah, so there's going to be a site name that is just it's just sort of like what is the most visible thing when you're looking at a site. So that it can be found. And then in the description, a lot of times it will have additional information. So if you click more on any of these ones, it'll have a little bit, or usually it has a little bit of a narrative description as well. And those are primarily for helping people to find the location.
So Sarah, on the ones that say site no longer present, is that because those particular items are gone?
Yeah, so sometimes that means we did a cleanup and we confirmed that it's been removed. Sometimes it means the landowner did a cleanup. Sometimes it means there was a flood. Sometimes it means the person who was camping there had the opportunity to remove all of their items and took it with them. It just means it's not there anymore. And then we clear those every couple of months so that it doesn't get too crazy. They actually there's a layer at the bottom of KML that has a year's worth of the site no longer presence that you can turn on and off, but we have them default off because it just is too much on the map.
This is, there is so much information in this.
Yeah, we record about 4,000 data points a year, and each of those data points each of those places have additional, timestamp. And I think the other thing that we do a lot that isn't on the public map is that we can, because we have all the metadata for all of these different parcels in terms of who the owners are and all that kind of stuff, we can generate some really quick reports of how many of these by type are on public property, how many by type are on city-owned property, how many by type are on Caltrans property, and so we can do reports for pretty quickly. We can run reports for any landowner that we're meeting with or anything like that. And we do trend reports by week for the city of San Diego and by month for all the other landowners.
Okay, go ahead.
I just had a question. I was just wondering how you record the initial data.
We have an app, a smartphone app, and we have teams that go out on the riverbed 3 times a week. And so then the little purple balloons are active encampments. Those are the only ones where some of the data is hidden on the public site. So this is the only data they'd be able to get is the approximate location based on where the icon shows up, the title and the amount of trash and when it was recorded. But if you have a login, you'd be able to see. Usually we have photos, often we have like the number of individuals, whether or not our outreach partner made contact with those individuals, if they have any pets, you know, all that kind of stuff, so that we can have a little bit better data. But there's some privacy stuff for those, obviously, so we don't make it available to the public.
Sure, thank you.
Sarah, can you talk a little bit, I know this is getting into the weeds just a little bit and maybe a little bit off topic, about why you used Mapler and what you think about it?
Sure. We used Mapler in part because we've just had a relationship with this developer for a long time, and he was able to do it for us for a not insane price point. But also a lot of our volunteers, we were previously using a GIS powered tool, and some of our volunteers struggled with using the tool. And because this one's Google, it's just a little bit easier for our volunteers to use. And then we can export all the data into GIS where we have all these layers, so that it's pretty easy for us to still do the reporting. But the Google powered tool is just easier for our volunteers.
Is this tool available to others?
So we pay for Mapler, and the app, you mean?
Yeah, the Mapler or the app.
Yeah, Mapler, we use the app is called Mapler K2, and anybody can download it, but you have to log in to be able to access one of these maps. So I control who has permission to add data or edit data. So we actually have this map, which is our trash map, but we use the same tool for headwater sensitive species surveys, and we use it for invasive plant surveys, and we use it for water quality. That one is a we have certain collection sites, and then we have time data, so it's a little bit different, but yeah.
Great.
We collect about, I think I said earlier, 3,000 to 5,000 waypoints a year. So this tool just doesn't have enough bandwidth to let us do trends over time, because it's just too many data points and starts to be too expensive for us to pay for the server space.
But you have those data. I mean, that's the thing. It's just a technical barrier to
Sure.
being able to put out those information to show that, right?
Yeah, we have basically a full data download from every day that we do a survey. So we do surveys right now 2, 3, 4 times a week. And every time we do an edit, we have a download of all of that data. So we have it's something like a couple hundred a year versus spreadsheets that are just a complete picture each time.
Really cool, Sarah. Thanks for the tour there. That was great. And so, in terms of these examples, it sounds like these data they're essentially all, you know, that they are associated with homeless encampments. Is that correct, Sarah?
Yeah, we have a training that we do to sort of determine how we determine it's associated with a homeless encampment. The one, we kind of do it by mode of transport also, because one thing that that isn't captured by this is that we have stormwater debris that is definitely encampments that got washed out, but we record that as stormwater debris if we believe it was carried to its present location by water. So even though that trash may be associated with encampments, after our last storm, we tried to quantify that, and we came up with kind of a rough multiplier that about 75% of the stormwater debris we record probably originated from an encampment, not like came in from an outfall. But we don't have, that's definitely run through a anecdotal filter, not a hard data filter.
Yeah, it's really cool. And it's sort of, I feel like I said that was difficult putting words in those boxes on that question, but looking at the functionality of your tool, it seems something like, you know, what we have here going in the Central Coast, which is, you know, telling us a lot about trash that's coming off of city streets, in combination with something like that that focuses on riparian areas or urban, you know, riparian urban corridors, that would go a long way toward trying to answer that question of the relative contributions of these different types of sources.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we have, I mentioned that we have a layer that we're working on that would model the storm, when we have storm water that raises the river. We've also got a couple of things where we're trying to document all the various outfalls that happen on the river so that we can see exactly where we see the stormwater in a little flume outside of the outfalls. But there's a lot of layers that I think would be really interesting to, you know, put over this data that, you know, if they could overlay, would be really meaningful.
Very cool. Any further thoughts on Q1? We can keep rolling. On to question 2. Does somebody want to take the lead on walking us through these and maybe designating where they think those biggest gaps are in each of these steps? Don't all jump at once. I'm already talking too much.
Gary, one of the things I would recommend to people, and in looking at all these questions, is, you know, it's looking at, is there a difference? Is there a difference? And what I would encourage people to do is to come up with what that difference means to them. Is it a 10% decrease? Is it a 50% decrease? Right. What is the difference that is meaningful to you? Because I can think of instances where you've got a decrease, but is it significant enough to make a difference?
Yeah, are we talking, this one we're talking about, the amount that's evading management, right?
Yes.
Okay. I like the regional scale. That makes the most sense. You're necessarily going to be outside of municipalities. Increasing, decreasing over time.
I like whoever added the modeling to estimate transport mechanisms under analysis that have wind patterns and storm events, because especially for stormwater BMPs, that's going to be really important. An absence of data, if we didn't have a storm, may not mean anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was Grant's idea. I wrote it down. I think that was Grant's idea at the previous board. Because it's like we can only measure so many places. And so if you want to infer what's going on in the places where you're not measuring, well, you're going to need to extend the utility of those measurements via a model of some kind. Might be very simple, but still a model. How well defined do we think the experimental design that's out there given data collection is for this management question? Is there a design in place that we could use to definitively address this question? There's some good suggestions here. But I feel like the design is not really out there to do this. I'm going red. Any dissenting opinions? it doesn't, I mean, I can't think of a design that's explicitly targeted to being able to like formally address a hypothesis like that.
Can I go back to Shelley's comment? And I think maybe it was on the testable hypothesis comment. The amount of trash leaking into waterways is increasing, decreasing. Do we need to have something a little more definitive, like 25%, 50%? What is important?
Yeah. Sorry, guys, I blew by that one, but that's important. What percent change are we hoping to detect? I guess I stumbled on that one because I was thinking about percent change rather than how much volume is coming, you know, evading the management in the city.
And then I have one other question. What time are we supposed to go back to the main room?
2:30.
Thank you.
Yeah. Increasing or decreasing, whether it's increasing or decreasing, I suppose that's a little bit different question than how much, right? You could have it increasing or decreasing and still be a lot more is getting by than is being managed or something like that, right? Or vice versa.
Yeah, or maybe how the increase or decrease correlates to management actions is probably part of it.
Yeah, okay. That's this one. I like that.
So, Sarah, are you talking about like effectiveness of the different BMPs?
Yeah, I guess if like counties are deploying more BMPs or whoever, you know, whoever is the permittee is putting out more BMPs, or is that correlating to a trend downward?
Yeah. It feels like though we're getting close to the other question, which was about effectiveness of a program, right?
True.
Oops.
Well, I think it's kind of related too, because in the other one it talked about you looking at volumes of trash before capture. That would be applicable here too, right? Is like if you have an idea of how much is going into the system and you can measure how much is still coming out of the system, that'll kind of get at both of that, right? Like how much is bypassing and also how effective is, you know, one measure over a different type or something.
Good point, Sarah. It's like it's almost impossible to extricate the questions from each other. If you're addressing one, you're probably going to be addressing the other.
Right.
So is this well defined? Have we done a good job, or is there a good job out there, or is this fuzzy? Does this get a pink designation? Or is it okay?
I think the question's approachable for sure, right? It's just how to measure that consistently.
Yeah, okay. Drone or app-based data capture, geospatial, specify, trash, setting, and source. Are these data out there, or can you access them?
No, not usually. Not in a comprehensive way, usually.
Not if you want to know. It's like the problem Grant brought up, right? It's like, well, you can know something about how much you're capturing, but it doesn't tell you the flip side, how much you're not.
That's very red.
Red. Oops, whoa, that's super red. Is it redder than that? I mean, so for analysis, like I agree. I think this is a great approach conceptually, right? Like using those measurements, develop a model to do these estimates. But as far as I know, that doesn't exist out there right now. Does anybody else know? Somebody that's come up with that? Going red. It's almost like, well, it's hard to have the data products if all the links in the chain are broken, you know, up to there. I mean, these seem like the right maps that you would want, right? Be able to interpret the patterns, maps to visualize, giving meaning to these different sources of volumes. But without the data, we can't make the map. Great examples of what the products might look like. Can whoever put these examples up give us a flavor of what you were thinking, adding these guys?
Maybe that was Kate before she left.
Oh, we lost Kate. Okay. Climate change and disease outbreaks. You want to find some good data products. I guess that's where you go. It makes sense. We need the stormwater trash analog to these sorts of data products. We're going a little bit short on time, so does somebody want to lead us through this one for a couple of minutes? This is the effectiveness question, the $1 million question.
I guess this one doesn't really have a scale like the other ones did, but I feel like this can be on multiple different scales, local, regional, watershed, etc.
Yeah.
But the hypotheses here are pretty, I mean, I'd say fairly reasonable. You're looking at differences between, you know, either status quo and change, or, you know, change over time. I think they're very approachable hypotheses for the most part.
Yeah. How about the experimental design? Sounds like a longitudinal approach is specified here. Repeated measures over time in the same locations. Perhaps a before-after, with the breakpoint being a policy change or substantial implementation of stormwater control measures, trash control measures.
Depending on what kind of measure you're looking at, you kind of have a set time frame as well then.
I don't know what you folks think. I feel a little bit better about this as an experimental design. I feel like in the lease case, many cities have in place some baseline monitoring conditions in place, sort of setting the stage for a longitudinal study along these lines. I'm not sure how much that's out there, but it feels like the experimental design feels more tighter for this, more well defined, and some of the baseline data have already been collected over the last few years to set that up.
Yeah, I think at the municipal level, this one would be pretty easy to kind of hash out if the data is already being collected and you can do that comparison over time. So at that scale, the stormwater scale or the network scale.
I guess I feel the same for the data collection. That with the trash amendments, if we're at the municipal scale, I mean, again, it can always be better, but it doesn't seem like the weakest of the weak links.
Yeah, I think if we're going to talk about some of the environmental scales, like in the first testable hypothesis, that would be more difficult, but definitely would assume, and this is very little knowledge on the trash provisions and the implementation of those policies, but if the municipalities are already reporting out on that, I figure this would probably be pretty streamlined from start to finish to answer some of those questions at that level.
So yeah, for like the trash provisions, the municipalities aren't really collecting data like outside of their, catch basins. We have information on like the number of catch basins that are put in priority land uses, et cetera, but I'm not sure if they're capturing any downstream information. I don't think they are required to, especially if they're in tier 1, which would be, I guess, useful for information for figuring out, if downstream trash is actually being reduced as more and more of these BMPs are put into place.
Yeah.
So again, I think that this question interrelates to question 2, how are what's the volume leaking into the waterways from these management practices, downstream effects?
I agree. It's hard to pull them apart. I think we're about to get teleported back into the big room, folks. But we can pick this back up in discussion another time, I hope. Thanks so much for your contributions to these. That was great. That was really fantastic. And let's go tell everybody about what we did.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.